when you have a bunch of people who show up to work who should have never had that job in the first place, they start finding things to do, actually. And that's what gave us that regulatory morass in the first place, like the Federal Reserve. I mean, if you just fired, about 22,000 employees in the Federal Reserve, if you fired 90% of them, there would still be 2,000 left, which is arguably on the high side if you have a Federal Reserve whose sole focus is restoring the stability of the U.S. dollar, which I do think should be the sole mandate and sole purpose of the U.S. Fed. Same thing with respect to, you go straight down the list, EPA,
what else
SEC, FTC.
What do 22,000 employees do at the Fed?
Oh, they do a lot of calculations. They do a lot of conjecture, and it feeds their hubris a little bit. So markets, and I worked at a hedge fund. That was the first job I had for 7 years out of college, and, understand the way in which people will huddle around divining what the exact meaning is of a comma at the end of Federal Reserve minutes. Does that mean that they think that the economy's overheating so much that they have to raise interest rates? That feeds the kind of hubris of the bureaucrat to make them think that there's some kind of genius and some kind of actual savant that merits this attention. But the reason the market actors pay attention to what these Federal Reserve people say is not because they have some sort of expert knowledge that's actually meaningful. They're actually looking to see effectively how they're going to screw it up in the process, right? And so academics took over the Federal Reserve in the late 1990s.
But the Fed only has one big lever, right?
Well, they have a few levers actually they're able to pull. Yeah. I mean, just one big lever broadly means how much money you feed in or suck out of the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's true, but they've used that in ways that have been, I think, badly destructive to the country. I mean, because here's like an example of how. So when the academics took over the Fed in the late 1990s, like one of the things that happened, and this was a kind of managerial class in this agency, and that's a three-letter agency in some form, the FED, right? What they said was, okay, if wages are going up, this is a long story if you want to get into this, but we can give you a short version. If wages are going up, that is a leading indicator of inflation. So wage growth was a bad thing. So the way you fight wage growth is by tightening monetary policy into wages going up. Here's the problem with that. And anybody who's run a business knows this, okay? Wages are generally the last thing to go up in the business cycle. If things are going really well in the business cycle, the last thing most employers want to say, I'm not saying it's the right decision or the wrong decision, but most employers, the last thing they want to have go up is the wages. So wages tend to be actually not a leading indicator of the business cycle. Wage growth tends to be a trailing indicator of the business cycle. But you have the academic mindset of the Federal Reserve that said, that's one thing we can measure, that we can observe and feel smart about. So wage growth, we're going to treat that as a leading indicator of inflation, even when it's a trailing indicator. Well, what does that mean? They tighten monetary policy precisely into a natural downturn of the business cycle, which gives you the boom bust. And then what comes after a bust is of course, the bailout. So you get these boom bust bailout cycles. That's exactly what happened. You could say in 2000, you could see it in 2008. You could see some version of it, even in 2023, although that was a little bit more subtle. And so anyway, that's a whole rabbit hole about the Fed, but it's an example of when you have 23,000 people show up to work who should have never had the job in the first place. They start finding things to do. And when you find things to do, that ends up being destructive rather than helpful, which means the root cause is you got to get rid of the presence of the people who populate that bureaucracy.